Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last of our series on climate change and extension issues as this series of webinars. So today we're going to be addressing some of the issues with beliefs on climate change, withdrawn from some people who have been doing work on studying some of the attitudes about climate change and how to educate people more about climate change. Our first presenter of the two for today is a newly minted Ph.D. from Iowa State, who is currently with the Northwest Regional Climate Hub in Corvallis, Oregon. Gabrielle Roesch-McNally just received her Ph.D. in Sociology and Sustainable Ag from Iowa State. She was one of the lead social scientists on the USDA-funded Sustainable Corn Systems CAP, which I was part of. Then she explored adaptation and mitigation in the U.S. Corn Belt agro-ecosystem. She's now a fellow, as I mentioned, at the Northwest Regional Climate Hub in Corvallis, where she's working with the Hub's mission in translating climate science and assisting stakeholders with resources and applied research that will assist them in addressing climate changes on their land. So, Gabrielle, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks. Can I just get a confirmation that you can hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for having me, and thanks for putting this together, and for all the help from Laura Edwards and Hans Schmitz and others, and Dennis as well, for this webinar. I'm excited to be here. So I think Dennis did a nice job of presenting who I am and what I'm about, so I'll move on to my presentation. So I'm going to be talking about communicating climate change and lessons for extension outreach. So I'm going to do a little bit on my outline of my presentation. So I'll just do a little brief research background, then I'll talk more about the data that we collected and some of the findings around climate risks, beliefs, and adaptation, and then talk about some of our extension communication recommendations, and then hopefully have some time for questions and discussion. So my project, a lot of the research that I'll be presenting here today is a part of this project that Dennis already mentioned. The USDA thought it was pretty important to understand how climate change is going to impact a lot of different cropping systems in the U.S. My project focused, a project of a lot of other people, focused on corn systems. The project is a 6-year project that integrates the knowledge of many specializations to guide adaptation and mitigation in Corn Belt agriculture. And you can see we had field trials, social and economic research, analysis and modeling, extension, as well as education. So it's a very large project with a lot of moving parts. I, of course, will only be talking about a small portion of that. So a little bit more information on the project. This just gives you a sense of the study region, and I understand that most of you on this call are from the Midwest or the Upper Plains, so I think you're familiar with the region. We collected data from 35 field sites and literally talked to thousands of farmers across 9 Midwestern states. We were exploring the implementation of really a suite of practices for corn-based systems that retain and enhance soil organic matter and nutrient carbon stocks, also reduce off-field nitrogen losses that impact greenhouse gas emissions as well as water pollution. Wanted to help create systems that better withstand droughts and floods, and then to ensure productivity under different climatic conditions. So I just want to call out, I'm presenting most of the research from this corn cap, but there are many others working on climate change across the U.S. And for some of you, you might be moving between different regions, and I think it's important to think about some of the other research that was funded by these big USDA climate coordinated agricultural projects. This is not a comprehensive list, but to give you a sense of some of the other projects out there, there was a project focused mostly on southeastern forests, pine map, but for those of you who work in areas that are a little more diverse with more forested regions, there might be some outputs from that project that would be of interest. There's also the project that I'm going to be pivoting to working more closely with because of my new position here in the Pacific Northwest, the REACH project, which is really focused on cereal production and wheat, but again, there are some cross-cutting things that might be relevant to your region. There's a sustainable dairy project that was kind of headquartered in Wisconsin, the Great Plains Grazing Project called the Grazing Caps. USDA climate hubs are now working across all these regions to provide tools and resources around climate change on working lands. And then the useful, usable tools may have already been a part of this webinar, but I know Dennis has been greatly involved with that project. I do have some live links here, but certainly connect with the folks who are organizing the webinar if you want access to any of these resources or can't find them, or contact me directly. So I want to just start out with thinking about what are some of the climate risks in the Corn Belt specifically. And the reason why I bring this up is I think it's important wherever you're working, when thinking about working with farmers and landowners in general, to be aware of what are the climate-related risks for your region. And certainly we're getting better at downscaling these large global climate change models to make them more relevant to local regions and hopefully more and more specific areas of the country. But just some of the things to think about, some of the impacts to the Corn Belt, we expect, increased severity and frequency of extreme weather events, as well as disease and pest pressures increasing, and those are expected to have an impact on crop yields. We also expect that these more extreme weather events are going to impact environmental impacts that are already occurring with agricultural practices, so we might see increased erosion and soil degradation, as well as water quality impairment due to sediment loading and nutrient transport. And I think that's true, across the country, seeing some of these issues that might already be happening with agriculture and environmental impacts being exacerbated in addition to some of the productivity concerns. So things to keep in mind. So the data that we collected as part of our project in terms of the social science data combined survey data as well as in-depth interviews. So in 2012, we conducted a survey with nearly 5,000 farmers. It was focused on larger scale farmers who primarily raised corn and soybean, and it was stratified across 22 Huck-6 watersheds, and in a previous map, you kind of saw that map of those watersheds. And then we also conducted in-depth interviews with 159 farmers across multiple states, corn and soybean farmers. We really recruited them from the Land Grant Extension Network. I think it's really important for me to call out the extension educators who helped to collect these interviews as part of our research project. Hans actually is one of them, and there might actually be others on this call today, but we couldn't have done this project without our extension educators. So before I get into some of the results, I think it's also important to think about just agricultural behavior and decision making. Probably a lot of you aren't social scientists, but I study the humans in the agroecosystem and what kind of decisions they make and why. And it's important to think about these decisions, especially when we're talking about climate change, as really being embedded in intertwined social, technical, and ecological contexts. Sure, I don't have to tell most of you that farmers are responding to weather-related risks on their farms, but they're also responding to a lot of market and policy drivers as well, in addition to lots of other things I can't get into here. So climate changes and then extreme weather events are just part of what farmers are dealing with and responding to in their everyday decision making, as well as their seasonal and more long-term decision making. But it is also interesting to think that the decisions made by farmers at the field scale, which in aggregate has an impact on landscape scale issues, can help reduce vulnerability and enhance resilience. And I provide this resilience definition by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to think about what we would like to move towards in terms of thinking about climate change impacts. Farmers might be able to shift their decisions in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure, while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So it might shift some of the ways we do things on the landscape. So folks are often interested in climate change beliefs. So what are farmers saying in the Midwest about climate change and its causes? So first we see that very few farmers believe that climate change is primarily caused by humans. But a great deal of farmers, the majority in fact, think it's caused more or less equally by natural and human causes. And then a great deal of them, at 25%, also say that climate change is happening, but it's mostly due to natural changes. And then, so 66% of farmers are actually talking about climate change and believe climate change is happening. And I think that sometimes that number surprises people because we might expect it to be less. And but I think it's a great deal. It's a great place to start when we're thinking about communicating climate change, because a lot of people do believe it's happening, while there is some disagreement about some of the causes. However, it's also important to know that 31% of farmers are concerned or not sure. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty, what I'm presenting here is about the beliefs and the causes of climate change, but we also can think about uncertainty in terms of what are some of the impacts. So, and I think there's even greater deal uncertainty. I'm analyzing some future research right now, or on current research that I haven't published yet about this uncertainty, and farmers are really concerned about what are actually going to be the impacts on my farm, and we're still kind of getting a sense of what those will be at the field scale. And then a very small percent of farmers are saying that climate change is not happening at all. And one of the things that I want to point out here with the belief conversation is that beliefs are important because they actually influence, research is finding that they're actually influencing how farmers perceive extreme weather events. So Niles and Mueller, in a recent paper they published in 2016, actually found that belief about climate change is actually influencing their perception of extreme weather events, temperature, and other events. So the more belief in climate change occurring and that it has something to do with human activities tends to increase people's perception of risks. But we can also think about it a little bit in the other way, that people's and farmers' experience of extreme weather events also helps to shift their beliefs. So there's an iterative relationship going on. But beliefs also influence farmers' support for adaptation. So this is some of our survey data, and it's about adaptation. So whether or not farmers should take steps to protect their land from increased weather variability, or whether they themselves should take steps to protect their land from increased weather variability. And what we can see is that a number of farmers agree with these statements, but it does kind of go along with their beliefs. So the more a farmer believes that climate change is occurring and due mostly to human causes, there's the most support for adaptation, and that declines as we see less and less belief in climate change. And the results are even more extreme when we think about mitigation, and we're talking about mitigation here as reducing greenhouse gases. So the question or the statement here to agree or strongly agree with was government should do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or I should reduce greenhouse gas emissions from my farm operation. And again, belief had a really strong influence on whether or not they agreed with these statements. So, but again, going back to this uncertainty piece, so while there is this belief relationship and support for action, a lot of farmers are still really uncertain about what the climate change impacts will be, and whether or not it's enough, if there's enough information to justify changing their agricultural practices. So there's a paper that we hope will be coming out in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in the next year looking at this issue. And we see, the darker color here on the map of our 22 HUC6 watersheds is the percent of farmers who agree that there's just too much uncertainty to justify changing their practices. This is a little bit of a smaller subset of the farmers, the 5,000 farmers, because there were some farmers who were uncertain about whether they were uncertain. So those farmers were removed from this analysis because it was difficult to understand their uncertainty about uncertainty. But for the farmers who responded saying with a great deal of agreement that there was too much uncertainty, we see that that's kind of ubiquitous across the landscape. So we think that uncertainty is a real challenge when it comes to taking action in response to climate change. However, I think, one of the positives here when we think about talking with farmers is that farmers do take action to respond to weather on a seasonal and daily basis. So they already are responding to weather-related events on their farms, but there is uncertainty about how to change their practices in response to more longer-term climate changes. And I think it's important to make some temporal linkages and defining sort of what we think about in terms of weather and climate. I'm thinking this webinar series has already kind of talked about some of these things. But that's something to, when we're talking with farmers, to think about sort of making that distinguish between weather and climate. And then one other piece I wanted to add here is really understanding your audience. So I don't want to spend too much on here, but this is work actually out of the REACH project here in the Northwest. They actually looked at some of our partisan beliefs. How do those influence our belief around climate change? And as you can see, the more conservative farmers were less likely to believe in climate change being caused by human activities. Although if you look across all of these, there's still a great deal of belief in some amount of climate change happening, but belief in causes does fall on partisan lines. And this really is very much replicated in data across the country, not just on farmers and landowners, but the general public, that we see climate change belief has a lot to do with people's partisan identities. The piece that I think is important here is to be aware of that issue, but also be aware of some of the good scientific information that we're using to sort of talk with farmers about climate change, and that a lot of farmers, despite perhaps their partisan beliefs, they believe that climate change is impacting them, and that's a great place to start with the conversation. So to recap on beliefs and actions, beliefs are in part driving perceptions of weather-related risks, but there is a partisan impact there. Beliefs also influence support for adaptation and mitigation, although adaptation less so. Farmers are more supportive of adaptation regardless of their beliefs, but mitigation is a little bit harder to sell. Uncertainty is also a huge factor, so we need to reduce uncertainty and focus on what you know. So this is going to more communicating, talking about what do we know about impacts in the region, or in talking with farmers about what we project impacts might be on their farms. Location and time matter, so some other research not specific to our project has really looked at the importance of focusing on local places. So when talking to farmers about climate change, focusing on their farm and what are some of the tangible future impacts, but also actions that they can take to reduce risks in general. And then how can we connect future impacts with actions that farmers can take now? And of course, our project really focused on no-till, cover crops, drainage water management, precision nutrient management, and diversified rotations. But I think all of you are working on different strategies to help farmers maybe meet productivity goals, reduce environmental impacts that might also help them be more resilient to more extreme weather events. And then I'm just going to move through this really quickly. I also did a lot of work specifically on adaptation strategies. So what are farmers doing? What are they planning to do in response to climate change? What I've presented here is mostly around beliefs, but there's some really good stuff about kind of what are farmers planning to do in response to more extreme weather on their farms. I'm just going to give a real quick summary and recap here. If there's more interest, I can follow up with folks later. So the highlight is there is willingness to adapt. So farmers adapt, this is what they do, and this comes out of our interview and survey data. Farmers are already adapting to seasonal and more long-term weather changes. We do know that risk perceptions motivate behavior, particularly concerns about extreme rain events and soil erosion. So that's driving farmers to change some of their practices. What farmers are currently doing, so the practices that they've already implemented, that's going to be a big driver in what they plan to do in response to climate change. So getting farmers to shift towards practices that we know will build more resilience now will help set them up for the future. But we already know that farmers are adapting their systems in response to increased weather variability through greater soil stewardship. And I'm hopefully going to have a paper out here soon about this whole idea of soil. And soil, I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but talking about soil and promoting soil health and reducing erosion is a way that I think is really going to be an effective way to talk to farmers about reducing weather-related risks, but also maintaining on-farm productivity. And then finally, climatic factors are not going to drive adaptive decisions. Again, going back to that earlier slide, farmers are responding to a milieu of drivers that are influencing their decisions, and climate and weather are just one of many things they're responding to. So I want to highlight this report that you see on the left side of the slide is actually, you can find it on our sustainablecorn.org website, and it's a piece that was put together by a number of the folks who are involved in the corn cap, as we call it, sustainable corn cap, and a lot of the extension educators who, again, some of them might be on the phone here, help to contribute to. And then we used a lot of the social science data that was collected to inform the development of this, as well as experiences on behalf of our extension educators. So I don't have a ton of time left, so I'll try to move through these fairly quickly. So, and this is trying to hone in the findings that I found and tying that to things that you should be thinking about when you're doing outreach and communication with farmers and other landowners around climate change. So focus on practices that reduce weather-related risks, and kind of tied to that is thinking about kind of beginning the conversation with farmers about reducing increased weather variability or reducing weather-related risks rather than jumping right into a conversation about climate change, because we know that climate change has this sort of partisan or politicized perspective. Getting farmers just to think about how to reduce weather-related risks is a great place to start. So we can build on farmer confidence and capacity to adapt. A number of farmers that we surveyed and interviewed are confident in their ability to respond to changes in the weather, and they feel they have a great deal of capacity to adapt. Promoting soil stewardship in terms of soil health and erosion prevention may be an effective way to discuss reducing weather-related risks and getting farmers to build a more resilient field and farm. And then also explore decision support tools that allow farmers to protect soil and water resources. And there are many of those. Some of the projects that I mentioned earlier on are a good place to start to look at some of the tools. And the climate hubs that are based regionally are really focused on developing tools that can be used by farmers and other stakeholders, extension educators, and others to work with farmers and landowners to address climate change on their land. And then we also want to think about tailoring messages to the audience. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but increased weather variability might be an easier sell than climate change, at least to begin the conversation. Focusing on specific actions that farmers and other stakeholders can make. Extension is a trusted source of climate change information, as we found in our studies, so that's a great starting place. And there's certainly a lot more support for adaptation and mitigation, so there might be opportunities to look for co-benefits, so things that might help reduce greenhouse gases, but also would be considered an adaptive strategy. And then another piece that we highlight in our report is this need for building institutional support, and I put this in here because I hope folks begin a conversation about this with the people in your office and statewide extension. So we need more support for extension efforts to address climate change adaptation and mitigation. We need to build better linkages or improve linkages between extension and locally relevant research on climate change. We've been, out of our work, been trying to promote this idea of an agri-climate coordinator that would be based in extension at the state level. So hopefully seeing those kinds of people pop up in extension across the country would be a great movement forward to provide the resources and support that many of you would need to do more research and outreach, or outreach and communication with farmers. And then we need to build more partnerships, enhance resources available to extension. So improve linkages between university researchers and extension educators, continue to engage agricultural advisors and private sector support, and engage with regional climate hubs. I put that last one in there because this is my new work, and I think it's important to highlight the exciting work that the hubs are going to be doing to try to aggregate information, communicate climate science, and provide tools to help landowners address climate change impacts on their farms and manage lands across more than just farms. So I think I'll leave it up for questions. I know I went a little bit over, so I'll let Dennis sort of manage our time there. But my contact information is there. Feel free to send me an email or tweet to me at Roesch, and check out our website.
Okay, thank you, Gabrielle. Excellent job covering a lot of information very quickly there. A lot of good stuff that came out of your research and the corn cap. And we will now open it up for questions too for a couple minutes for specific questions for Gabrielle. I guess I'll throw one out there. How much do you think your work in the Midwest will translate to the Northwest? Do you think there's a regional difference between those two, or do you think that they'll kind of follow along with each other from what you've seen so far?
You know, I think that's a great question. I don't know the entire answer to that, but I'm really interested. Actually, that's one of the projects that I would like to endeavor in, is to really build better linkages and synthesis work based on these regional caps. You know, a lot of good information was collected, especially around climate change, and I'd like to see that put into resources that would enable us to think about communication and climate change efforts, across multiple regions, and what are some of the highlights that are kind of true across the board, or what are some of the things that are different. But I expect that a lot of things will be similar in terms of some of the beliefs and challenges with uncertainty. I think that a lot of that will be similar. I'm still digging into some of the research that folks here have done, but I think that tracks fairly well. And the soil health piece, I'm really interested in exploring more. I know there's some work being done in the Northwest and, of course, other regions. The NRCS's Soil Health Initiative, has really been pushed on promoting no-till or reduced tillage and cover crops. And I think that the sort of saliency of talking about soil resources for farmers and land managers, I think that's going to track well across many regions, especially as a way to kind of talk about reducing risks through something that, most land managers are having to deal with, right? Everyone's working with soil. Soil is an important resource that we need to manage for, and it does impact both environmental concerns but also productivity. But that's more or less a hypothesis of mine. I think more work needs to be done to investigate how important that concept is for communicating risks.
Okay, thanks. If there's anybody else has another question, I think we can slip one more in here. Okay, let's go ahead and switch presenters here. Our next presenter is Julie Dahl from Michigan State. Since 2009, Dr. Julie Dahl has been the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Long-Term Ecological Research Project at the Kellogg Biological Station with Michigan State. She develops programming for various stakeholders, including farmers, extension educators, policymakers, teachers, students, and the general public on ecology and field crop agriculture with an emphasis on climate change. So, Julie will continue the conversation about climate change and education. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you so much, Dennis, and thanks to the organizers and Gabrielle for setting the stage. Gabrielle and I coordinated a little bit beforehand. We thought it would be great for her to share some of that important regional research, and then I am going to follow up with a couple of concrete examples of how we in Michigan have been communicating about climate change with farmers and with Extension. So, very simply, when I speak with Extension about why would we want to communicate with farmers about climate change, it's pretty basic. Climate change is real. That's the scientific consensus. Scientists are concerned about its effect on agriculture, and we would like to help farmers adapt to changes and to be part of the climate change solution, otherwise known as mitigation. But oftentimes we talk more about being part of the solution than using the term mitigation. Today I'll share with you 4 examples of how we're doing this through farmer focus groups, farmer panels, an exercise called fish bowls with farmers and other groups, and then incorporating climate change into existing programs that extension educators are already implementing throughout their states and regions. I'm going to be pulling a lot from this guide called Connecting on Climate, a guide to effective climate change communication. And before the report that Gabrielle mentioned came out, that guide for extension, a lot of us were looking for science-based information that would help inform us on good and thoughtful ways to communicate about climate change. And this has been one of the best resources I found. This is the 2nd edition of it. This one came out in 2014. You can download it from the website that's on the screen. And it compiles a lot of research on effective ways to communicate about climate change. Their kind of short and dirty list of guiding principles includes the following 10, and I'll just read them quickly. Put yourself in your audience's shoes, channel the power of groups, emphasize solutions and benefits, bring climate impacts close to home, connect climate change to issues that matter already to your audience, use stories and images to make climate change real, make climate science meaningful, acknowledge uncertainty but show what you know, approach skepticism carefully, and make behavior change easy. And I think we heard a lot of these themes come out through Gabrielle's work. As I talk about the 4 examples, that we've done in Michigan, I'll be pulling from these guiding principles and kind of highlighting which ones we used and followed for which activity. All right, I'll start with the farmer focus group. So we held 2 rounds of farmer focus groups in order to learn from farmers to help us shape extension programming on climate change, and also to inform the broader community of scientists and policymakers and others about some of the realities that farmers are facing. And for those of you not familiar with what a focus group is, basically it's a facilitated discussion. So I, as the researcher, would ask a number of questions to a group of farmers who were sitting around a table, such as the one you see in the picture. I would not offer my opinion, I would not share research, etc. My role really was just to listen and learn from them. Excuse me. We had great help from Extension and from our Farm Bureau and other organizations recruiting farmers to these focus groups. And so we held 2 rounds of them over the winter, making it easier for farmers to attend, and talked to over 50 farmers who represented almost 60,000 acres in 20 counties across Michigan. All right, I'm going to share with you just a few of the themes that came out of this work, and once again, thanks to Gabrielle for setting the stage. This definitely resonates with what that large research project found. One farmer remarked, "I've seen it get hot and get cold, get hot and get cold, at different periods in my life. So I think it's more of a cycle than it is a total climate change." And so our experience with talking to these farmers over the 2 years was that very frequently there was a level of defensiveness when we first asked farmers, what do you think about the linkage between climate change and agriculture? Farmers oftentimes felt defensive about it and kind of pushed back against this idea of human-induced climate change. Once they got over that and realized that we weren't there to judge them, they really settled into these very interesting, nuanced conversations about the effects that they really are experiencing. So they might not call it human-induced climate change, but they are definitely experiencing changes on the ground. And one of the biggest, if not the biggest change that farmers noted was changes in precipitation patterns. So this comment reflects that what we heard over the 2 years. We used to see more intermediate rain showers, a ½ inch to an inch, but now we just get gully washers. Farmers talked about adaptations that they're making. They might not have always recognized them as climate change adaptations, but they talked about some things that really aren't commonly heard of in the literature, and this is one example. A farmer said, because of climate change, you are buying bigger machinery, you are doing stuff in a hurry. And he was focusing on the fact that he was experiencing less workable days in the field. And the literature supports this, that in states such as Iowa and other Midwestern states, there's actually less days that farmers can get into the field on their soils because of precipitation changes. One farmer said, I guess if I could summarize, it doesn't matter what the weather is going to be in 20 to 30 years from now. It only matters what it's going to be next year, and nobody can predict that. So our research found that farmers felt that they were reacting more to climate change and changes in the weather as they talked about it, and that they weren't being, they didn't feel that they had the capacity or the agency to be proactive necessarily when it came to adapting to climate change. And I think that's one of the key areas that Extension can help with. What really surprised us was how grateful and enthusiastic farmers were to talk about climate change. So when we invited them to these focus groups, we specifically said we wanted to talk about climate change. We didn't say weather risk or, mitigating risk or weather variability. We said climate change. And one farmer said it was nice to be asked about an important subject rather than being told what someone else thinks. They just felt a sense of validation. Another farmer said on an evaluation that we gave afterwards, it was nice to be listened to. They listened to what I had to say and they wrote it down. That meant a lot to that farmer. Farmers also expressed, as Gabrielle mentioned, that Extension is a trusted source of information. So one farmer said if MSU, so Michigan State University Extension, is sponsoring the endeavor, there's got to be some basis behind it. And if my extension educator thinks it is important, then so do I. And so my colleagues and I have tried to share this information, these findings, with Michigan State University Extension, letting them know that farmers, can be engaged on this topic and that they do look to Extension for climate change information. And because of that, we've shared some of this information with Extension here in Michigan. We've helped them organize themselves. We now have a climate action team or climate outreach team that spans across all program areas in Extension here in Michigan, with ag being really well represented on that team. So to summarize some of what we found, farmers reacted somewhat defensively to the term climate change, yet they clearly articulated changing conditions and specific actions they're taking in response. They're concerned they're being blamed for climate change. I didn't talk much about this, but our research showed that there really is no silver bullet for adaptation. There's such great variability within and between farms and years. Farmers appreciated being listened to and dialogue. We think our research points to the need to really include farmers in the conversation, and a lot of other climate change research has shown the same thing. That's just a brief bit about those focus groups. We're in preparation to be submitting the manuscript by the end of this month, so stay tuned. So what about those guiding principles? We felt that our focus groups helped bring climate impacts close to home, and we also channeled the power of groups, so making it easier for people to talk about and think about climate change when you bring them together in a group setting. The second example I'll share with you is something we've done both here in Michigan and across the North Central region during workshops we've hosted on climate change and agriculture, and that's really about learning from the leaders. So when we've hosted these events for extension educators to talk about climate change and agriculture, it's always number one on my wish list that we include a farmer panel. And so that's what you're looking at right here. The farmer panel's on the right. You can't see the whole room of, 40 extension educators from across the region on the left. But these farmer panelists were sharing what they've been experiencing on the ground, their thoughts about mitigation, their thoughts about adaptation. And these have been really powerful during the workshops. I think during a lot of the post-event evaluations show that oftentimes these are the aspects or the times of the workshop that extension educators value most. And I think it can help give confidence to extension educators who might be hesitant about talking about climate change if they can first hear, a group of thoughtful leader farmers talk about climate change and how they are experiencing it. And so for this example, we tried to connect climate change to issues that matter to your audience, right? And we use images and stories to make climate change real. The next example I'll give is a technique called the fishbowl technique. And this is a new way to dialogue. And I want to give a shout out to folks in Illinois who, funded by the North Central Region SEER program, put out this publication called Fishbowls in the Field in 2007. And if anyone wants a copy, I'm happy to email you a copy of it. But it's just a great guide on how to host conversations between and within groups of people who might have differences in education levels or power levels or different thoughts and opinions. And it's a way to help different groups of people dialogue about a topic. And so in this example, we brought together farmers and extension educators and scientists to talk about climate change. And we did a little bit of a modification, but here's what we did. So we started off with sharing information to a group of farmers whom we invited about climate change. And we had kind of the most trusted extension educator talk about the topic. So in this example, many of you may know Dr. Dale Much from Michigan, who's now retired, but it's just an invaluable resource. They've been working with farmers for 30 years on cover crops, and they knew him well and trusted him. And so he got up and talked about nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas that many are not familiar with, or many are not familiar with its potency. So Dr. Much did that, and then we brought the farmers together and asked them a series of questions related to Dale's talk, and we also had our state climatologist, Dr. Jeff Andreessen, give a presentation, and then another presentation on biofuels. And so after the presentations, like I said, we brought the farmers together. So the farmers sat at a table in the middle of the room. What you're looking at is the group of scientists and extension educators who circled that table and were there only listening. So the farmers were in the fishbowl, if you were, with everyone else observing what the farmers were saying in the fishbowl. And one of the rules of this dialogue was that, only the farmers could talk and answer the questions that I was leading them through, asking them about climate change, what they thought about the research that they had just heard. All the scientists and extension educators had to be quiet and just take notes and listen respectfully. And I'll tell you that that was kind of hard for some of them. They weren't used to that role, but they did it well. After that, we brought everyone together in one big circle and talked about our findings. And this was a day-long event. There was a lot of trust built up throughout that day, and so topics were really able to be delved into that maybe you wouldn't be able to if you just brought in a speaker, had them give a talk for 20, 45 minutes, and then had a couple minutes for questions. I think the level of dialogue would have been a lot different in that situation versus actually having the farmers heard and having the scientists really hear what the farmers were saying as well. So like I said, it's been a really great technique. I've used this technique in other situations too and modified it. We have a report. If you're interested, I can send you a copy that we published just internally about this process and what we learned from Michigan farmers through this technique. And so with this technique, once again, we channeled the power of groups. We acknowledged uncertainty, but we showed what we did know, right? So we had the scientists come in and say, this is what we do know. And then they could also talk about, here's what we don't know. Here are the areas of uncertainty. And I think that was really important for the farmers to hear. How did the farmers feel about this odd new approach, this fishbowl approach, if you will? 100% of them said that the discussion format was a comfortable setting, and we did this the number of times across the state, the winter of 2013, I believe, with cherry farmers, with field crop farmers. We also did that with some agribusiness and Farm Bureau folks as well. Okay, 98% of the farmers felt completely listened to at the event, and they agreed they gained something from the discussion, and 100% agreed that the discussion was an effective way to gather information. And so I think that, kind of going back to what we learned in our focus group, that if the farmers feel listened to, just like all of us, right? I think that we're much more receptive to learning and hearing what another perspective might bring. Well, what about extension educators? This was a new technique for them. This was something really different for them. One of the educators said, one farmer I had been working with on a separate project had expressed doubts about climate change. However, after participating in the 2013 discussion, that farmer had this to say, I think there might be something to the climate change stuff. So for this educator, this format was highly effective and really helped bring that message to the farmer that they had been working with on the topic of climate change for a while. The last example I'll share really hits home, I think, and highlights Gabrielle's important point about focusing on soil. So here's an example of a way to incorporate climate change into existing programming. So when I and my colleagues have put on workshops for extension, helping them learn about climate change, helping them think through how you might communicate about climate change, one thing we hear over and over again is, there's no way I would invite my farmers to a topic, a workshop just on climate change. Is there a way I can't weave it into things that I'm already doing? And so we thought about that and felt that with the use and the excitement over a rainfall simulator that we have been working with farmers on across Michigan, we could do that. And so just to walk you through, for those of you who are not familiar with what a rainfall simulator is, here's the instrument in the photo. There's a shower head up at the top that simulates rainfall at different intensities. That rainfall falls on different types of soil that have been under different types of management. And so there's In this case, I think we had 3 soil bins. One was bare soil, one was a pasture with perennial grasses, and the other was bare soil but covered with some stover. That rain has 2 options, right? It can infiltrate through that soil pan and it can fall into the infiltration collectors, or it can flat out just run off the top of the surface. And so this is just a really powerful tool to demonstrate how we manage the soil, what kind of effect that has on both runoff and infiltration. And so extension educators in my state have been having a great deal of success using this rainfall simulator. And when I saw it, oh my gosh, we could, or could we link, you know, what they're doing with soil health and link that to climate change, because one of the changes we know that is occurring is both more precipitations in this region annually, and it's coming in heavier rainfall events. And so that's exactly what we did. We wrote a grant and got some funds to create programming around soil health and climate change with this rainfall simulator really as the centerpiece. And so here you see in the black shirt, extension educator Marilyn Phelan from Michigan, talking to a group of scientists and extension educators and NRCS people about this curriculum that we had put together. So we put together posters that you can take out into the field that show data such as this. So this is from Jeff Andreessen, our state climatologist, just showing how the annual precipitation in Michigan has risen by about 10 to 15% over the last 3 decades. And we printed these posters that extension educators and others can check out. We also put them into a PowerPoint presentation, and we have a notes section there with a script. So if they're not comfortable interpreting this themselves, the interpretation is right there for them to use. So here's another example, pulling from the National Climate Assessment in 2014, thinking about observed changes in very heavy precipitation for our region. So as I mentioned, that was one thing that Michigan farmers really commented on, and the data backs it up, right? And so we think that by showing this in the field with use, in conjunction with this rainfall simulator, it will help validate what the farmers say they're already experiencing, and then we can talk about other things such as projected changes, or how might we manage our soil better? How might we make our soil systems more resilient? And so here you see Marilyn and another educator, Paul Gross, just showing some of the posters that have been printed and that are available to check out, along with the rainfall simulator, which can be checked out and used with farmer groups. And they have said repeatedly to me, these extension educators, that when they take that rainfall simulator, I mean, it just opens the door for dialogue and discussion. And they've done it with farmers, with drain commissioners, with NRCS, with all sorts of, ag or land management type people, and have really been grateful for the way that it sparks dialogue. And now grateful that that's a way of weaving climate change without having to put a workshop on just about climate change. And so the guiding principles for this were emphasizing solutions and benefits, bringing climate impacts close to home, make climate science meaningful, acknowledge our uncertainty once again, but showing what we do know. Here's the data that we do have. Here are the trends that we do know are occurring. I put up the long-term ecological research webpage here just to let you know that curriculum on the rainfall simulator is available online. I can send you a link for that. We also have worked hard to put together a series of extension bulletins on climate change and agriculture. And so I would just be really happy to share any of the resources that we've put together, and I'm also excited to learn from you all and hear about your experiences. And my hope is that, as we continue these efforts, I know I'll definitely learn from you, and I'm excited now that Dennis is in the Midwest Climate Hub, and definitely keep these efforts going and learn from each other's experiences. So with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to Dennis.
Thank you very much, Julie. Very nice job. And at this time, we'll also open it up for any questions you have for Julie Dahl at this time. Julie, I'm curious, how did you just do these meetings just one winter then was how you did that?
So we've done, with the focus groups, we did them over 2 winter seasons, and then with that technique that I called the fishbowl technique, we did do that mostly just 1 season. Yeah, okay. So it's interesting because it's kind of all built on each other. You know, that those focus groups, you know, we thought we were just getting information to kind of help, I don't know, extension programming a little bit, but what we learned there has really kind of blossomed into all these other activities that you heard about.
Any thoughts on recent research on emissions from ag farm and how extension can approach this topic?
Okay, so any thoughts on how ag extension might approach the topic of greenhouse gas emissions from farms? I really like what Gabrielle said about thinking about the co-benefits of mitigation and adaptation. So for example, if you know, and I'm going to speak from the field crop perspective, not animal agriculture, but from the field crop perspective. If, you know, we can look at that data and it shows the amount of nitrous oxide emissions that are coming off cornfields because of, you know, nitrogen fertilizer application rates, if we can talk to farmers about, you know, helping them fine-tune their nitrogen rate, and wow, you know, we can get it to the plant when it needs it, lose less to our water, save you money on fertilizer purchases. Oh, and by the way, we can also help reduce nitrous oxide emissions. I think that that could be one way to go. And I'll open it up if Gabrielle wants to chime in as well.
I might just add, I think that's a great answer, Julie, and I would just add that I think, you know, a lot of farmers in the Midwest region, but certainly elsewhere, have dealt with water quality issues, and so we've already seen this sort of push in terms of regulations and addressing, you know, how do we have agriculture and cleaner water. And I think there are a lot of practices, you know, nutrient precision management, improved nutrient management, a lot of BMPs that aren't as applied on the landscape at the scale that we might want to see that have benefits for water quality, and we can kind of see the same in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. And so I think having encouraging sort of our communities to think along those lines, because we've seen changes happen in the water quality conversation. I guess I see some similarities in the climate change conversation in terms of how do we improve productivity and also have these environmental benefits. And I think we can have some of the same conversations around climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. And actually on the water quality stance there in the soil, there are connections there as well. So reducing some of our impacts to water and improving the efficiency of our farms are going to have some productivity benefits, but they're also going to probably help with water quality issues as well as addressing climate change impacts. So I think there are some co-benefits, and I think in terms of communicating, promoting, and talking about practices that do have those co-benefits, and starting at the field scale, how does this improve a farmer's bottom line potentially and the operation of their farm, and then scaling up, thinking about what are some of the other benefits, I think will be important.
I'll turn back over to questions, or if there's more conversation here.
So I see a question from Erica. Is there any evidence from farmers that extreme weather events are resulting in noticeable economic impacts in terms of crop yields or quality? And if so, which crops? So Erica, I'm going to just tell you that a paper was just released with the title of Influence of Extreme Weather Disasters on Global Crop Production. So there's definitely scientists who are looking at this issue and seeing how droughts, you know, and floods or extreme wetness have been impacting things. And then I'll turn it over to Gabrielle because she probably has a better handle on what farmers are saying across the region for that.
Yeah, I think, you know, I know that there are some resources out there that have looked at this. Scientists are certainly looking at that. As I mentioned before, this sort of synergy of different drivers, so certainly what's happening with the market, say for corn, you know, have been on people's radar. So there are a lot of different things that are driving sort of farmers' perception of what's impacting the prices that they're receiving on the market. And so I think the climate, tying it specifically to sort of weather, issues is tricky because there are a lot of factors at play. I can bring up some of our interview data around droughts. You know, it was interesting to see for some farmers that the impact of that big drought in 2012 was very, farmers, you know, definitely tied that to their bottom line, but it was variable. So for farmers who had sort of the right microclimate and received timely rains, and they talked about actually really benefiting because, as we know, the prices for corn and beans were great that year. So if you were able to get a crop, you did quite well. So you may have been impacted by the drought, but in the markets you actually did okay. And then there were some farmers who were really devastated by that, but perhaps got crop insurance, and that helped sort of reduce some of the risks. So in my experience from the data that we've collected, the conversations about you know, market impacts have you know, they're still really tied into some of these other things and the volatility of commodity prices and whatnot. So I think farmers are talking about that, and I could probably look in if folks are really interested. If you want to email me, I could probably pull out some papers on this topic, but I think you will find that it's challenging to parse out, you know, what are the drivers there, because it is complicated on the landscape.
Are there any other questions anyone has at this point? Okay, seeing none, I will thank both of our speakers. Excellent job today. Thank you for your conversations. And this does conclude this webinar series. Thank you for your attendance, and we hope you have found this enjoyable.